The rookie's doubt. I didn't notice the blood on his boots at first. That's what I keep coming back to. I don't know how I missed it. Maybe because it wasn't dripping, wasn't smeared, just dried and blackened at the edges of the tread, blending in with the dirt. Maybe because when you're the new guy and your partner vouches for someone, you don't question it. Or maybe I didn't want to see it. This was just over a year ago, in the fall of '89. I'd been on the force for maybe 6 months, assigned to a quiet little patch of California about an hour north of LA. The kind of place with one grocery store, one bar, and a gas station where the clerk knew everyone by name. Quiet as hell, at least until what happened out on Ridge Road that night. It started with a 911 call. A neighbor reporting weird noises from the house across the street. Said it sounded like someone screaming, then laughing. The dispatcher tried to get more info, but the guy just kept saying the same thing over and over. Something's not right over there. My partner Dave was driving that night. He was one of those older guys you immediately respect, not because he demands it, but because he's got that quiet confidence that makes you want to. He'd been on the force for almost 15 years, had a wife and 2 kids, and never once made me feel like a rookie. Then there was Greg. Greg was different. Mid-30s, ex-military, kind of a loner. Kept to himself most of the time. But when he did talk, it was always a little too loud, a little too forceful, like he was trying to remind everyone he was there. He wasn't officially our partner, but in a small department like ours, you ended up working with everyone sooner or later. That night, Greg met us at the house on Ridge Road. It was a 2-story farmhouse set back from the road, with a big yard that hadn't been mowed in weeks. The porch light was on, but the house itself was dark. Creepy as hell, Dave muttered as we stepped out of the car. Greg was already there, standing by the front gate, flashlight in hand. He nodded when he saw us but didn't say anything, just pointed toward the house. The front door was unlocked. We called out as we stepped inside, announcing ourselves, but there was no response. The place smelled off, like mildew and old food, but not enough to set off alarm bells. The living room was empty. So was the room was empty. So was the kitchen. Then we found the stairs. The first thing I noticed was the dark smudges on the banister. Blood? I whispered. Dave shone his flashlight on it, then frowned. Maybe. Stay close. We moved upstairs, slow and quiet. I could hear Greg behind us, his heavy boots creaking on the wooden steps. The first bedroom we checked was empty. So was the second. But the third, that's where we found them. A man and a woman, lying on the bed. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. There was blood everywhere, on the sheets, on the walls, even on the floor. The woman's throat had been slashed. The man had a bullet hole in his forehead. Dave cursed under his breath. Greg didn't say anything. We didn't find the kids until later. It was a small bedroom tucked in the corner of the house. The door was half open. I wasn't expecting to see what I saw. The first body was the boy, no older than 8. He was curled up in a ball, his hands clutching the sheets, face twisted in a silent scream. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. The blood had dried in patches on his clothes, his little face streaked with it. The girl, his sister, I figured from the matching pajamas, was sprawled across the floor by the foot of the bed. Her limbs had been twisted in unnatural angles, like a doll that had been dropped too many times. Her chest had been crushed, her ribs shattered. There was no question now. It wasn't just a random act of violence. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure the entire family was destroyed. Dave took a breath, trying to steady himself. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "We need to get this place locked down," he muttered. Greg stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He moved past Dave, walking toward the girl's body. I felt something shift in my gut, something I didn't want to acknowledge, but it was there all the same. I glanced at Greg's boots. They weren't clean. I don't know what made me look, but there it was. Small, dried flecks of blood, almost invisible unless you were staring right at them. They weren't fresh, but they were unmistakably blood. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. It was an insignificant detail, but it gnawed at me. I wanted to turn away from it, to focus on the crime scene and not get distracted by something that might just be an accident. But I couldn't. It lingered in the back of my mind, hanging there like a shadow. Dave went downstairs to speak with the dispatcher. Greg stayed in the room inspecting the bodies, but there was something in his posture, his stillness, that made me uneasy. He wasn't acting like a cop should act in a scene like this. He wasn't disturbed. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't anything, just distant. "Think it was a robbery gone wrong?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Greg didn't answer right away. Instead, he just looked down at the bodies, his eyes scanning them slowly, methodically. "Nah," he muttered after a long pause, almost as if he were talking to himself. "Doesn't fit. Too personal." His voice sent a chill through me, and I suddenly realized just how close I was to him. "What do you mean personal?" I asked, taking a small step back. Greg finally turned to face me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "A man shoots his wife, sure. A guy might snap, kill the kids, the whole damn family. But the way these two were..." He trailed off, then looked back at the bodies. His gaze lingered for a beat longer than it should have. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound calm. "It doesn't make sense." But it did. Something in the way Greg said it did make sense. A dull weight hung between us as we stood in the dark room. It felt like the air itself had become heavier, pressing down on me. I wanted to be anywhere but here. I didn't even want to look at the bodies anymore, let alone stand next to Greg. But when you're the new guy and your partner vouches for someone, you don't question it. That night, things happened fast. The scene was secured, and the bodies were taken in for autopsy. But something was off. The coroner found more blood, more than was physically possible from the wounds. The boy's throat had been slit, but there were deep puncture wounds all over his chest, like someone had been stabbing him over and over, even after he was dead. And then there was the phone call. The one that came after we'd already left the station, after everything seemed settled. It was a tip, a random caller who wouldn't give their name, saying that the family had known the killer, that the killer had been inside the house, had been living with them for weeks. That's when I learned something I shouldn't have. Greg had been spending a lot of time with the McAllister family lately. It was a detail I'd overlooked earlier, the kind of thing that never seemed important until you were looking at it from a different angle. I started asking around. The town didn't seem to have much to say about Greg, but there were whispers that he'd been close to the family. Too close. Maybe he had a reason for not reacting the way a normal cop would to a massacre. I didn't want to believe it, not yet. But as the days dragged on and more information came to light, I couldn't ignore it. Something wasn't right with Greg. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And that's when the rookie's doubt took root. Max Donovan was never the kind of guy to turn his back on a gut feeling. But the more time went on, the more it felt like the truth was slipping through his fingers, just out of reach, like an old photograph fading in the sun. He didn't know it yet, but Greg wasn't just a cop. Greg was the man who had ended the McAllister family's life. And he was about to become Max's worst nightmare. The first day I started looking into Greg, I told myself I wasn't going to make assumptions. I wasn't going to be one of those rookies who jumped to conclusions because something felt off. But I was starting to see the pattern, starting to notice the little things that didn't make sense. The first thing I checked was his record. I went through the departmental files, searched through his history. There was nothing particularly alarming at first glance. He'd served in the military, came back, did a tour in law enforcement, and then moved here as if looking for a fresh start. But there was a gap, something like 6 months or so, where his file went silent. No transfers, no reports, no reason. I didn't like the feeling I had in my stomach when I found that gap. But it wasn't just the gaps in his history that bothered me. It was his behavior. Something in the way he moved, the way he stood just a little too still. like he was always observing, always waiting. It was the way he avoided making eye contact when anyone asked him about the McAllisters. And when he spoke of the case, his words were too controlled, like he'd rehearsed them. It was all little things, tiny clues that screamed at me in the quietest moments. The next piece fell into place when I went to the McAllister house again, this time without Dave. I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. The house was still under investigation, but it had already been cleared by forensics. Nothing new was uncovered at first glance. No hidden weapons, no strange messages written in blood, nothing that screamed motive. But then I noticed something odd. In the closet of the McAllister's master bedroom, behind some old clothes, was a wooden box. I hadn't seen it the first time I'd been here. Maybe it had been hidden. Maybe it had been overlooked. But when I opened it, my heart stopped. Inside, there were photographs, a collection of them. Hundreds of shots scattered across the bottom of the box, each one of the McAllister family. But they weren't happy photos. These were taken at night from afar, through windows, from the shadows. There were shots of the kids playing in the yard, of the wife and husband walking out the front door, even a picture of the family eating dinner at their kitchen table. It wasn't just creepy, it was personal. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was some sick joke. Maybe the killer had stalked them before the crime. But as I sifted through the images, one thing became crystal clear. Greg was in one of the photos. He was standing in the yard just outside the frame of the shot, but his silhouette was unmistakable. I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't call anyone right away. I couldn't. I needed to know more. The photo was damning, but I needed concrete proof. I couldn't just go to Dave with a suspicion and a blurry photograph. He'd want more. I spent the next few hours digging, calling in favors from the other officers in town, piecing together what little information I could. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tie Greg to the McAllisters in ways that no one had talked about before. The family's finances were in trouble, badly in debt, but what I didn't know was that Greg had been helping them. Or at least, that's what he told people. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The details were off. Greg had been offering financial help, more than what he could afford, and more than what anyone could explain. And then I found it, a loan document, signed by Greg and one of the McAllister children. A loan for an amount of money that no normal person would ask for, something over $10,000, signed just weeks before the murders. The loan was officially listed as private assistance, but the way it was written, the way Greg's name was signed on the dotted line, it felt like a mask, a cover-up. I couldn't get my head around it. Why would Greg do that? Why would he help them? What was the connection? Then the last piece clicked into place. I went to the McAllister's bank, pretending to ask for some standard information for the case. The clerk, who barely knew me, gave me a strange look, but handed over the paperwork I asked for. It wasn't until I started looking through it that I saw it, a series of strange withdrawals occurring at odd hours of the night. And Greg's name, signed on several receipts as if he had been the one taking the money out of the account. But it wasn't just the withdrawals that got me. It was the last one. A final withdrawal, just days before the massacre, an amount that seemed excessive. And at the very bottom of the receipt, there was a single note. Meet me at midnight. Everything's almost ready. Greg. I didn't wait to investigate further. That night, I followed him. Greg left the station around 9 p.m., his truck driving at an unusually slow pace. I kept a good distance behind him, making sure not to get too close. He took the same route as the night of the McAllister murders, down Ridge Road toward the farmhouse. I stayed back, parked a few hundred yards away, and watched as Greg stepped out of his truck. At first, nothing seemed unusual. He stood outside for a moment, his back to me, but I couldn't hear anything. Then the door to the McAllister house creaked open. And that's when I saw her. The woman was standing on the porch, her face half hidden by shadows. She looked out over the yard, and for a moment, I thought she might have seen me, but she didn't seem to notice. Instead, she took a step toward Greg. I couldn't hear their conversation from this distance, but I could see the way Greg moved. His posture, his gestures. It was too familiar, too intimate. Then the door closed behind her. I waited for what felt like hours, my breath shallow in the cold night air. But finally, Greg came back to the truck, his face tight with something I couldn't place. Frustration, maybe. As I made my move, stepping out of the car to approach him, he noticed me almost immediately. His expression shifted, hardening into something cold. "Max," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something far darker than I'd anticipated. "What the hell are you doing here?" I had no choice but to confront him. "Greg," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to talk." I don't know what I expected him to say. Maybe a lie, maybe an excuse. What I didn't expect was for him to smile. A small, tight smile that made the hairs on my neck stand up. "Max," Greg repeated, stepping closer, his voice low. "You should have stayed out of this. You don't know how deep it goes." And that's when I realized it wasn't just the McAllisters that had been destroyed. It was me too. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Greg's smile was unsettling. Not because it was malicious, though it certainly had that edge to it, but because it was so damn calm, so controlled. Like he was watching me, studying me, figuring out what I'd do next. "You think you know what happened, Max?" he asked, his voice low and even. "You think you've got it all figured out?" I didn't answer right away. My mind was racing, replaying everything I'd learned in the past 24 hours. The photo, the bank records, the loan documents. Greg had been hiding something, a lot of things. But this felt like something more, something deeper. It wasn't just about the murders anymore. It was about him, about the way he'd been watching me, guiding me without me even realizing it. "Greg," my voice barely came out. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. "What the hell is going on?" He took a step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You're not ready for this, rookie," he said, "but you will be soon. Just give it time." His eyes narrowed. "You don't even know why you're here, do you? Why you're following me?" I was shaking now. Not from the cold. It was the way his words seemed to pull the ground out from under me. I was out of my depth and Greg knew it. I hadn't realized just how much control he had over everything. The case, the people involved, even me. I clenched my fist, trying to steady myself. "You killed them," I said, my voice shaky, but growing steadier as the words left my mouth. "You killed the McAllisters. You killed that family." Greg didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. He just tilted his head, like he was considering me, like I was some kind of puzzle he was still figuring out. "Killed them?" "No, Max. I didn't kill anyone. They're all still alive." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. My brain couldn't process what he was saying. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "They're alive?" I asked, dumbfounded. The weight of everything, the investigation, the photos, the bank documents, felt like it was slipping away. Maybe I'd been wrong about everything. Maybe Greg had nothing to do with it at all. Greg laughed, a short, sharp sound. "God, you're naive. They're alive, Max, but they aren't who you think they are." I took a step back. "What the hell are you talking about?" He smiled again, but this time it wasn't calm. It wasn't controlled. It was twisted, dark. "You're starting to understand. I didn't kill them. I made them, and now they belong to me." I took another step back, my mind spinning. It was too much to process. This couldn't be happening. "Who the hell are you?" I blurted out, my voice hoarse. Greg took a deep breath, the smile fading from his face. "You still don't get it, do you? You think you're on a case, that you're here to solve a crime. But you're not. You're part of the game, Max. You always have been. It was never about the McAllisters. It was about you." My mind reeled. "What the hell do you mean? It was about me." Greg's eyes flicked toward the house. For the first time, his expression shifted, like he was looking at something or someone beyond me. I turned, but there was no one there. The darkness in the yard felt thick, oppressive. You were always meant to be part of this. You've been drawn into it from the moment you set foot in this town, Greg said, his voice low and dangerous. The McAllisters were just the beginning. But you, Max, you're the end. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. Was he threatening me? Or was this something else entirely? Greg, I said, trying to steady my breathing. What do you want from me? He stepped closer, his boots crunching with every step. I want you to stop fighting it, he said softly. You'll understand soon enough. You're not a rookie anymore, Max. You're part of something bigger than you can imagine. But you're not ready to see it yet. You need to wait. And when the time comes, you'll be the one to finish it. I didn't know what he meant, but I had a sinking feeling in my gut that whatever it wasn't going to end well for me. I turned, started walking back to my car. I don't know what the hell you're talking about, I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. But I'm done. This is over. Greg didn't follow me. He didn't say another word. I could feel his eyes on my back as I drove away, and the unease gnawed at me. I didn't know it then, but that was the first of many mistakes I would make, because I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went and how far I was from being able to crawl back out. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the McAllister family, their bloody faces, their lifeless eyes. And every time I blinked, I saw Greg, his dark smile, his cryptic words haunting me. I tried to go through the motions. I tried to do my job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was being watched, that I was being manipulated. And then it all came crashing down. I was at the station when the call came in. The dispatcher sounded frantic. "Max, we've got another one," she said, her voice cracking. "It's Greg. We found him. He's dead." I felt my stomach drop. What the hell happened? Not sure, but the scene, it's bad, Max, really bad. I didn't wait for the details. I didn't need to. I knew what had happened. Greg wasn't dead. He had just vanished.